You don't normally think of tiny startup industries like fighting against the full force of the US government. These sort of policy headwinds coming from the Biden administration and Gary Gensler, who thinks, everything is a security.
He was like, I think everything's a security. Like, okay, well, can we register the tokens? No. Can we register brokers to trade it? No. Can we register exchanges? So, I see. So he turned being a security into a life or death test.
For sure.
And he was like, oh, come in and register. Come in and register. Come drive down this dead end road where I'll beat you and sue you if you come in and register.
The interest from Wall Street at the time was like, oh my gosh, look at all those tokens, look at all those prices, look at these numbers, all this volume, all the billions of dollars that moved onto blockchains. What should we do? But the reality was blockchains were still too slow and too expensive to be even close to competitive.
Yep.
And so in the past 4 or 5 years, that's changed a lot.
Welcome back to the Slow Hunch. This week, I'm really excited to welcome MC Later and Marvin Ammori to the show. And we're going to talk about the Slow Hunch that they've been pursuing for the last decade or decade plus around the idea of democratizing access to finance through new technologies and the associated sort of policy landscape around that. I've known both of them for many, many years. Marvin and I go back over a decade. He's been working on internet policy issues like net neutrality and a bunch of stuff around crypto. MC comes from the world of finance and startups, and the two of them have been working together at Uniswap Labs for the last several years, where they've been working on a particular corner of this issue. Fantastic conversation. Two of the smartest and most ambitious people I know working on this set of topics, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. So maybe we should start by having you guys introduce yourselves and maybe take a crack at what you think the Slow Hunch that you've been pursuing together is.
I'm MC Later. I'm now starting a new company, but I was president and COO of Uniswap Labs, where I worked with Marvin for 4 years, and he recruited me there. And before that, built a few different fintech businesses as a startup, and then also at BlackRock.
So I'm Marvin Ammori. I've been a lawyer for a long time. I was like an internet freedom lawyer in the early days. I met USV back in 2005 when we were in the first net neutrality fight. I was a net neutrality lawyer. I was a privacy encryption lawyer. Back when you could be a generalist internet lawyer. And around 2016, I switched over and became a general counsel of companies. And I've been the general counsel of 4 companies, depending on how you count them, maybe more. And spent 4 years with MC, which was very delightful. I was the general counsel of Filecoin, or Protocol Labs, which launched Filecoin, and Uniswap Labs, which launched the Uniswap protocol. And I did a lot of policy work in crypto as well. So the Slow Hunch that I think MC and I have mainly been working on, and I'm sure MC can refine and improve it, is, we've sort of come up in a world where technology is totally changing like humanity and organizations and how people interact with one another. Technology is power, right? And who gets access to that, right? I worked a lot when it came to getting the internet deployed to as many places as possible, getting it in the hands of poor people in rural areas, educated people, uneducated people, just like access to the technologies, access to financial infrastructure, right? People who can't get credit cards can access mobile phones and crypto. So, access to this power, and also determining the kind of the allocation of power in society, right? How centralized is it? How decentralized is it? How do you empower the average person versus just the few? So I think in general, that's kind of the big picture thing that might be our Slow Hunch. And we've done that in very particular ways with very particular technology.
I met Marvin like 2015, and I started my career, I fell into Wall Street during the financial crisis. And and became obsessed with how the internet and technology could disseminate and decentralize some of the power that money creates and then the financial system creates. So I totally agree with what Marvin said. And then for me, the through line was, how does technology then help distribute power, specifically in finance and the financial system? And then that's how our paths are intersected in crypto specifically, because then in the sort of late 2010s, when crypto started to get more adoption, it was obvious that that could be a way potentially.
Yeah, and I like the John Oliver line about how crypto is everything you don't understand about computers combined with everything you don't understand about money, and pithy and hilarious. And in some ways, I think both of you as coming from the internet world and sort of the money and finance world, and being inspired by what happens, sort of the idea of the open, the potential of the openness and accessibility that the internet brings, and then later on, what happens when you collide that with finance, which is what crypto is.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, it kind of echoes USV's like open networks thesis, right? Like the power of networks, the ability to get networks in the hands of many people, and to kind of change things from, kind of centralized broadcast-like or bank-like to peer-to-peer, right? And that's been the through line, and it's been really fun.
And I also think we're if you think about the arc of the internet and the arc of as open media and open communications, and now crypto as the beginning of open finance and open assets, we're sort of much farther along on the first arc and just at the beginning of the second one, but they think they have a lot of ideas in common potentially.
Yeah. And we can talk about, I mean, this is kind of a complicated question. How right were we? How wrong were we? To some extent, the Empire Strikes Back, right? The internet and its openness resulted in some forms of consolidation, misinformation. I think I was really idealistic in the early days of the internet. Like, just information will set us free. The more access and information people have, the better. And it turns out like these are double-edged swords to the extent that it's essentially there are two sides, right? There are people who want to use it for good or whatever, people who want to use it for their own purposes, right? For concentrating power.
Or even sometimes that like creating access and simpler user experiences doesn't necessarily give people that much more power or freedom or agency, right? So I'm thinking about like in the 2010s, I worked on digital investing and robo-advice. And there was a lot of enthusiasm that being able to have like these simple mobile experiences would help people make better decisions with their money, and then therefore accumulate more wealth and have more financial freedom. And that happened a little bit, but also it wasn't really a panacea. It's still there's ultimately a hard human problem. It's like, do you want to think about what is your relationship to money? Do you want to think about finance? And that's part of what was appealing to me about crypto, is that then that put more pressure on like the actual like rails and the actual system itself.
Yep. And I think I want to come back to this question of unexpected consequences as technologies mature, and how how the idealistic vision of things can transform into maybe a different reality over these arcs. And I think a common theme here is like, what happens when things go mainstream? So the internet went mainstream. Crypto's about to go mainstream. I think you guys have been involved.
Is it really going to happen? I don't know. I don't know.
Obviously, you're
Did it happen?
You're going to make it happen.
I'm going to try. Yeah, thank you.
So can I dig into your history a little bit?
Sure.
MC very, very humbly was like, I fell into finance. But like, weren't you at like the most elite part of Goldman Sachs, the most elite? Like, how did you get there? What was that like? That's an experience like almost no one has.
Actually, that is part of how I got interested in how the internet would change money, is because I grew up wanting to be a writer and a journalist, and then saw how the internet was changing that industry and made it so different. And so I'd spent like all these summers as a high school student and in college writing and reporting and editing my college newspaper. And then I was like, oh my God, this is going to be a very different next 30 years than it has been last 30 years. So I fell into on-campus interviewing, which in my era was common to go end up in finance. And I ended up in like what Marvin did describe. It was kind of like this like Navy SEAL like little unit at Goldman Sachs that I had no idea was so special and people were excited to be in. And my first week on working there was when Lehman Brothers collapsed.
Oh, wow.
And so it was the financial crisis was happening at that time. And it was just so striking to me that like you had to, what rooms you were in, who you knew, what information you had was what determined the economic opportunities you had, whether it was like
Wow.
whatever kind of investor you might be. And it just was kind of obvious that the internet should make that information better and more accessible, and more competitive. And that the kind of like distribution pressure that the internet put on information that I just kind of observed in this funny way as an aspiring journalist. Well, that pressure on the distribution of money should be really good for like most people. And then I went to law school and not to be a lawyer, to literally specifically get into tech policy, and became an acolyte of all of Marvin's friends who were thinking about the future of the internet, and read about Bitcoin and was like, okay, this is really cool, this idea of an open financial system. So that's how I ended up in finance.
And bought Bitcoin in 2012.
Nice.
2011. Yeah.
Oh, watch out.
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
she didn't keep it.
I didn't keep it.
But that's pretty impressive.
And Marvin, what about you?
I actually grew up, my parents were immigrants from Iraq. They were Christians from Iraq, and so they left under Saddam Hussein. And so I grew up with this love for democracy and free speech. And for a long time, I was a First Amendment lawyer. And I wanted to be an author. And then the internet came along, and I wanted to be like a free speech fighter for the internet. And I fell in at Harvard Law School with a guy named Yochai Benkler, who became my mentor. And I think his children and Brad Burnham's children went to school together, so they became friends. That's how I met you guys back in 2005.
And he wrote this book, The Wealth of Networks,
yes.
right? Which was this sort of fundamental view of what can happen when you connected everyone and let them collaborate in new ways.
Like, I was interested in the notion that like talent was widespread, that you didn't have to be like rich or an insider to have an idea. And when the internet started proving that like talent was widely distributed, that really spoke to me. And I really didn't do anything else for like a few decades, other than like work on free speech and the internet and the First Amendment, through all these different permutations. And one of the things about crypto, which was interesting, is crypto came along and it kind of had the same promise. And I think it's taken longer for crypto to make the dent, because talent is widely distributed, but wealth is not. Right? It turns out that like wealth is pretty concentrated. So the people who think about money, who have to move money, who have that pain point of like the rails not working, is a kind of smaller group. But more and more, like as we have stablecoins and remittances, I think it's expanding a bit more. But that was sort of a wake-up call to me, like, oh yeah, the reason why, from my point of view, it didn't spread like wildfire the way the internet did, or even AI, which taps into creativity, is that wealth is so concentrated.
Maybe also that in the more advanced, wealthy economies have the more mature, high-functioning financial rails.
Exactly.
Despite all their problems, it's still working quite well.
It solves the problem best for people who have the least need for it.
So I want to get to the point where maybe you guys met.
Yeah. We were actually, he met my sister first, and I think that they were like it was like a New Year's party, and they were talking about, somehow Marvin started talking about net neutrality and the open internet. And my sister was like, this is an unlikely topic in this bar environment. Only my sister also likes to talk about these kinds of topics at bars. You should meet my sister. And so then we became really good friends. And Marvin at the time, and you should talk about the net neutrality era. And Marvin was like a huge pioneer and an advocate for making net neutrality possible. And basically, we have him to thank, I think, and you're part of it as well, like making
following his lead.
Yeah, exactly. For like engineering all this stuff to help keep the internet open. So I was a fangirl of that movement, having just graduated from law school, and we became friends. And I had just started I had a fintech startup that I shut down, and I had just started at BlackRock. And in like my second week there, Larry Fink, who's the founder and CEO, said something kind of inane about Bitcoin, which he now loves, but at the time he didn't. And so
we have MC to thank for that.
Yeah, thank you. And so I wrote a little like a memo that got forwarded all the way up the chain at BlackRock, where I was just kind of licking my wounds from my failed startup, about what BlackRock should do in digital assets and crypto. So
and this was around
2015.
When?
This was this was December 2015 when we met. So I had just this had just happened. I'd been at BlackRock 2 months. I'd sent this little like kind of rebellious memo, like really not.
It's like your Jerry Maguire moment.
Yeah, exactly. And they were like, you are now in charge of figuring this thing out.
Who's with me?
Exactly. And and Marvin had just like come come off this like extraordinary chapter of making net neutrality happen. And so we became friends. And quite soon after that, you got into crypto, like reasonably. So you kind of probably got to know me a little bit as a Bitcoin curious person.
Yeah.
And I knew him as a net neutrality hero. And,
So I'll tell the two stories in parallel. The Bitcoin story for me and the net neutrality story. So the net neutrality story, this is a thing that just we had to fight over and over and over. It's almost like how you fight for privacy over and over. There was a 2005 legislative fight, which resulted in, the famous saying that the internet is not a dump truck, it's a series of tubes. There was 2008 where I was the lead lawyer for the Comcast BitTorrent case. And then there was a 2010 chapter involving the first Obama FCC chairman that we kind of lost. And we kept losing in court, winning in the FCC, and there are all these different permutations. And then in 2015, we finally won. We won over a Kavanaugh dissent in the DC Circuit. They adopted the First Amendment theories I'd worked on for a decade, kind of over the theories of EFF and ESOU and everyone else. Like we had done the homework. We won resoundingly on everything, to everyone's shock, right? Like it's one of these things where at the beginning of 2014, when we would ask people at the FCC to include in the proposed order the option that maybe they would do the right thing, they would kind of laugh at us. And I'd say, this way we can't attack you for the next 6 months. Just put this line in there because we'll need it for the Administrative Procedure Act to eventually win. And I talked to the head of policy at Google, and I said, hey, do you mind if I work on net neutrality? I know you guys aren't working on it. This was in 2015. He said, sure, you can work on it. I know you care about this issue, but what's your strategy? I was going to say, well, you have to convince everyone. I was going to explain how there was sort of a chain of people you have to convince one by one. And now it's really kind of a game of persuasion. And I said, well, you have to convince everyone. And he cut me off, started laughing at me and said, even if Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and us spent every penny we had trying to fight the telcos, we would lose. You're going to lose. You're wasting your time. And then with none of them, we ended up winning. And after all of that, and like I was one of many people. Like I remember prepping Brad Burnham to testify in front of Congress. Barbara Van Schevick at Stanford was amazing. Fight for the Future, who will come up soon. That was a great group. They were very important. So we ended up winning. And then I was like, oh my God, I have not had like a vacation in a decade. And so I took kind of the next year off, and there were a whole bunch of things I wanted to do and go to. And on that list was like South by Southwest and Sundance Festival and Burning Man. Every year I was too busy to go to Burning Man, so I finally went to Burning Man. I ended up hating it. That's okay. But on that list was the event where I met MC. And so I was kind of like off that year after this big thing. And that's why I was sort of like open to like my next thing, and it ended up being crypto. But I first got interested in crypto in 2013 when Fight for the Future, this amazing digital activist group that I was chairman of the board of, did a Bitcoin campaign. It was Bitcoin Black Friday. Sent an email to their 2 million activists on their email lists. And a lot of these people were interested in like media reform, net neutrality, privacy. They listened to NPR and PBS. They got this email about Bitcoin back in 2013.
Amazing.
And some of those people replied, this is a libertarian pipe dream. How dare you send emails about this and support it? And so the team was like, hey, Marvin, you're on our board. You're a lawyer. You're a techie. Could you evaluate if we did something wrong, if we should be interested in this issue? And so that required me to spend like a few months thinking about it, because this activist group was interested in Bitcoin for funding dissident bloggers and moving money to like for free speech purposes. So that's when I like first bought Bitcoin and kind of got interested in it. And a few years later, when Protocol Labs, portfolio company for you guys, was interested in a general counsel, and they were building a decentralized internet, I called MC and I said, hey, should I take this job? And she said, crypto is not going away. So I took the job.
Well, it's interesting to think about net neutrality and sort of the internet as an open layer on top of the telcos, and crypto as an open layer on top of the financial system. Do you think of it that way? And in both cases, there's institutional resistance and also like regulatory resistance. FCC in the case of net neutrality, the SEC mostly in the case of crypto, and others. Do you think of those kind of parallels?
I think, yeah, they are parallels, but they have the way that we interact with money, the way we interact with information are just so different that they've expressed themselves differently, right? So like there's so much more fear and risk potentially around what you might do with your money, whereas your attention is actually pretty fluid. There's like almost no switching cost to your attention. And so I think that means that like even I was so compelled that like that decentralized protocols could disrupt the financial system, replace all these centralized intermediary functions, that anyone could create a market, anyone could create an asset, anyone could move, you hold your assets yourself, you can move them anywhere that you go. And that exists today for some people, like each of us who are, who've been in crypto for a while, we have pieces of that, but we also still have all this other stuff that's probably most of like your experience with the so-called real economy.
Right.
So I think that's true in theory, in the abstract. I absolutely think so. And I hope that we're getting closer there. And I think stablecoins are, I hope that they're like like a really powerful sort of like lily pad for many more future lily pads, like a very important next step for all that openness and that open network to start to get adoption that feels more integrated with like how you use money, how you spend, where you earn it, all that stuff.
It did take steps to grow the internet. You needed broadband, you needed mobile. Like there was a whole onboarding phase, but we got more quickly to having it in the hands of more people and sort of realizing maybe the promise or some of the big ideas around it. Whereas I think there have been maybe more institutional barriers, and there may continue to be more institutional barriers or habitual barriers or other barriers to changing how we interact with assets.
From a policy perspective, I would say there are some similarities. And I also think of DeFi as very similar to like the open protocols of the internet, right? Anyone can use Uniswap, anyone can integrate it. It becomes foundational infrastructure for so much of the rest of crypto because it's open and permissionless and all the rules are open.
Right. So the adoption sort of in the middle of that whole ecosystem has been very fast.
Yeah.
Right.
But you mentioned sort of the SEC and the FCC. And I remember before Gary Gensler, telling folks who would ask me about like crypto policy. So guys, this is super easy. We don't have any enemies yet. Like having an enemy, like we had an enemy when it came to the telcos, the cable companies, very powerful when it came to net neutrality. Right. We had some enemies kind of like the MPAA when it came to YouTube. And we didn't have any corporate enemies yet. But the corporate enemies, I feel like they really stepped up during the Gensler era. The banks and others kind of stepped up, and they were, I think, really behind a lot of the then we had a real enemy. That was really hard. And because I had done policy for so long, like I and others were able to see what was coming. And so if you remember in 2021, the Uniswap ecosystem with a visionary insight was proposing the DeFi Education Fund to help defend DeFi in political circles. And there was a bit of a backlash. The community did not yet understand that, wait, we're going to need lawyers and policymakers to fight what's going to happen here. There's a lot of like, we don't need these lawyers, or they're just, and there was this massive backlash, mainly by people who weren't in the ecosystem against the proposal. And then just like a month later, because like I saw the cookie crumbs, other people saw the cookie crumbs because we had pattern recognition. Just like a month or two later, there was the big broker rule infrastructure fight where the entire crypto community went, right? And then just a few years later, there's a $75 million super PAC and 150, right? So because we had seen this before in the internet, we were able to, and DeFi Education Fund ended up being super critical for changing hearts and minds in Congress and winning lots of litigation. So they're not identical, but there's a rhyming pattern.
So when Marvin called me, I was at BlackRock still in 2020.
Okay.
And Marvin had joined Uniswap. So he was at Protocol Labs and then went to Uniswap. And he called to say like, hey, I just joined this like small team of 7 people who've invented this decentralized protocol that is smart contracts in the Ethereum blockchain that let any 2 people transact by pooling liquidity. And that to me was obviously an example of a decent, and what we're talking about is like open network where anyone can create a market, and you don't need an exchange, you don't need a broker, and that was like very empowering. So I was extremely excited about these parallels and felt like at last, this sort of like open internet world that Marvin had pioneered was coming to the world of money in an exciting way. But I do think that just the way that people interact with money, two things I think were a little bit different. One is that like there's just so many government agencies that think their job is to protect people from doing unfortunate things with their money.
Yep.
And two is that if part of the product is creating money, which could be creating a token, then there's an incentive to make the value go up and to sort of like get lots and lots and lots more of attention if you're like a founder or a project. And so there ended up being just like heightened instant scrutiny and focus on whether all these things were good or bad in a way that maybe, as you were saying, the corporate enemies, government scrutiny, but also this like dynamic of early, like very, very small teams trying to actually get a lot of attention and being able to do that because of all these existing like the change in information technology. So that at first felt really exciting, and that it felt like in 2021, like it was all going to take off really fast. And then obviously we spent the last several years like kind of slowing down while the government figured out how they wanted to actually engage.
When I joined Uniswap Labs, right, it was, I thought it was this amazing place. I really loved Hayden as a founder, and the early team was amazing, and they're still amazing. But I knew that we needed someone like MC. Like I knew we needed like a business lead. Right?
And just to pause on that, what was the stage that Uniswap Labs was at around that time?
They had launched V2 of the protocol, and we had DeFi Summer. So people have heard of Uniswap. They've launched a token maybe a month before I joined. And this was late 2020.
Yep.
Still the pandemic. People aren't going to the office yet. And there was just a handful of people at the company, but I knew we were going to have to build a company, and we need sort of a business mind to lead it. And I could already see the cookie crumbs that like I was going to be very busy on legal. Like I there were other companies where like the first lawyer like just kind of became COO, and I was like, no, this company needs like a superstar. And so I called MC almost immediately. And I didn't even realize how amazing she was. Like I knew she was amazing, but I don't think it's almost like if you had never seen Michael Jordan play, you couldn't realize all the things that one player could be good at. It was like, wow, she can do everything. But so I was kind of, harassing her, I would say. I'd message her all the time. Like when she was unhappy at Uniswap years later, she would describe it as bullying her. When she was happy, she would describe it as like wonderful. But I messaged her all the time. And finally, one night, I almost never drink. And I was at home visiting family during the pandemic, and I had to stay at a hotel because back then you couldn't like go see like people with immune deficiencies.
Right. Yep.
So I had to like stay at a hotel for a few, and I ran into a friend who owned a restaurant, and he made me sit down and drink with him. So I had a few drinks, which is very unusual for me. But somehow it gave me a clarity of insight. When I came home, I called MC and I said, MC, what are you doing? She's like, oh, I'm like hanging out with friends. I'm like, no, what are you doing with your life? Like, and
I was like running a business at BlackRock.
She was doing something.
You drunk dialed her.
She was running a business.
Yeah.
And so I said, I've known you for many years now, and you've always said you're an entrepreneur at heart. You're entrepreneurial. You're a small company person in a big company. That's what makes you so great. That's probably true. But here's a company that's perfect for you, that needs like essentially you to come in and be the COO and help lead the company and take it to the next level. And it's exactly in a space that you love. Thing that we built, like according to the co-founder of Kraken, deserves a Nobel Prize for solving like long tail liquidity, right? It's amazing. If you can pass up this opportunity, MC, you can. But tomorrow morning, when you wake up, just brush your teeth, look in the mirror, tell yourself the truth. I'm a big company person.
If I didn't take the job. And I was like, oh my God, it was like an ultimate like neg selling.
It was an ultimate.
It really was.
And her next sentence was, wow, that's actually very persuasive. And then she just turned on the MC like charm and network and kind of did tons of research on us, asked everyone about us, figured out if she wanted the job or not, and just like pounced and killed and took the job. And it was awesome.
Thank you. It was really fun. I was very grateful to Marvin for convincing me of that. But because at the time, like crypto was starting to take off in 2021.
Yep.
But most of what existed was like selling Bitcoin to institutions.
Yep.
And what else was there? There were some Ethereum projects that were growing, and then centralized exchanges and layer one blockchains.
Yep.
And then the couple of DeFi projects had broken out, right? So Uniswap, AllFi, Compound, so lending and trading.
But I will say, like the courage it takes for MC to have taken that job then, like a 7 or 8 person company, probably everyone at BlackRock thought you were crazy. Had you gone to like an institutional Bitcoin trading firm, like no one thinks it's crazy now. But at the time, it
Right.
took like courage and like conviction, and it was great.
The other thing that was kind of funny about Uniswap at that time is
Yeah.
that the logo was a pink unicorn. Is a pink unicorn, right?
Still is. Yep.
Is a pink unicorn, and the website was kind of like mysterious. You couldn't really figure out what it did, and that's one of the things I love about crypto is that it brings this kind of like the playfulness of the internet to this other zone. But for that reason, as Marvin's saying, I remember I went to resign like the COO of BlackRock, and he pulled it up on his computer and he was like,
He's like, this is the thing you're going
this
to?
is what you're going to go do. You know? So,
Well,
yeah.
and I don't want to jump ahead too much, but I asked you the same question when we were on a panel at a conference a couple months ago. The scale of Uniswap, for those who may not follow, is kind of astonishing. Like what's the number today? Daily or weekly volume
Between 1 and 4 billion. And right now, Ethereum's up, so it's toward the higher
of daily
I'm sorry, of daily volume.
of daily
volume
swapping volume
on
and,
the protocol. Yeah.
And then back when we invested in the Series A right before you joined, Marvin, I think it was maybe $10 million a day. I can't remember what it was, but it was like a small number. And by the time you joined, it was not big. It hadn't yet gotten to the scale that it's at today. That today it's at this astronomical scale, but at that moment it was still not quite a proof of concept, but not
Well, it's interesting.
a huge thing either.
Right. Well, it's interesting because yes and no in some ways, in that the trading volume on the Uniswap protocol, there were fewer things like it. There was less
Right.
competition, and it was kind of peak at that moment.
Right.
Up until like we've had another bull market more recently, and then a little bit now maybe. But the protocol volume was about a quarter to half of what it is today.
Okay.
So it was still meaningful.
Oh, it was still quite big.
Yes,
back then.
but the
Yeah.
team was so small. So this is the beauty of a decentralized protocol, and specifically Uniswap, that it's like autonomous self-contracts. And so you can have everyone go home and it will still work. That's one thing coming from traditional finance, where I've been sort of like trying to build these fintech businesses to like push at the system and change it. You still have the same like infrastructure and operational
Yep.
kind of like requirements and constraints that comes with the infrastructure, even if in fintech. And so if you have a big trading day, you feel it. Like you feel it in the
Right.
team, you feel it on the floor. Even if you're at like Robinhood, you probably feel it. Whereas Uniswap, literally everyone could go home, go do other things, and the protocol will exist in perpetuity forever. And that is really empowering, because then that means that your team could have a lot of knowledge and build other things and keep building other things. And it gives also people, of course, like want to build on top of it, the credible neutrality that they can trust that it's not going to change and they can integrate it. So a lot of what we did to build the company from 2021 until 2025 was to help grow adoption of this technology, but it was also to think about what could you build on top of it. And I guess now that Gary Gensler's no longer around, like
RIP.
Yeah, exactly. When Marvin persuaded me to come join, 2021, I think he'd been named, but he hadn't been confirmed, and so nobody knew what he thought about it.
I remember,
right?
Yeah,
And
sure.
he taught this course at MIT, which you could watch on the internet, and it seemed like he seemed to know some stuff about it. And it was so obvious that crypto was like empowering and created access and competition and competitive pressure. You would think that a Democratic administration would be excited about that, opening up, increasing financial inclusion, putting pressure on corporate power and the big banks and all that sort of stuff. And then he kind of showed his cards quite soon that summer that was not what he believed at all. But when I joined Uniswap, I thought we could pursue a lot of different paths, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of what excited me when Marvin and I were talking about it. It seemed like the team could become a small research team funded by a DAO and kind of put forward a community roadmap and then be kind of like a steward of a lot of open innovation. Or that could open innovation continue, and the team itself could go a more traditional equity route and try to build like revenue generating products and build a lot of equity value. And then when it seemed like the government was going to have this like negative lens on anything that we did, on literally anything that touched a blockchain, could be considered as violating securities laws, even if it didn't actually match at all to the definition of a security, then it was very clear we had to go in this direction of building revenue generating products for the team's sustainability to like help kind of build the dream. So then we built a wallet, an API that serves tons of institutions today. They launched another blockchain, like an L2 on top of Ethereum. So in terms of like coming back to what you said, what was it then and what is it now? Like now it's the full stack. Like
right,
now
I see.
The Uniswap brand spans the chain, which is like if you're
Unichain.
analogizing.
Yep.
Unichain. So now there's Unichain, there's the protocol itself, there are versions of the protocol that allow for more customization. So you can have different kinds of assets, different kinds of users with like different needs. There's the API for institutions, and then there's the consumer products. So it's kind of in the traditional financial system, or even in fintech. That's like, that's like your Robinhood, your Citadel,
Right.
Your New York Stock Exchange, and your Amazon Web Services. But basically all on top of a decentralized network of computers and all branded Uniswap, if you choose to use them, but you can kind of swap them in and out.
It's really interesting to think about that period of time and how at that time to think about navigating a path for growth when two things are happening. Like there's growth in the protocol and in the network and in crypto broadly, in increasing interest and the need for all these products that you just mentioned. And at the same time, these sort of policy headwinds coming from the Biden administration and Gary Gensler, who thinks, everything is a security. I saw him give a talk at MIT back around that time, and he said something like, forget the Howey test, I use the duck test. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a security.
Yeah.
That's what he said.
Well, Gary Gensler's not a lawyer.
Right.
That's not a legal test. Right? He's not a lawyer. Most of his staff weren't lawyers.
Yeah.
And, being a security is usually not a life or death question, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Securities aren't illegal. It's not like, is this heroin or not, right? But what happened was, he was like, I think everything's a security. Like, okay, well, can we register the tokens? No. Can we register brokers to trade there? No. Can we register exchanges? So, I see. So he turned being a security into a life or death test.
For sure.
And he was like, oh, come in and register. Come in and register. Come drive down this dead end road where I'll beat you and sue you if you come in and register. And of all the big scams that happened during his era that he missed, Mr. Sheriff on the Beat missing Terra Luna, missing FTX. He was actually trying to give FTX a license before anyone else, probably because they were Democratic donors, right? I mean, he missed every scam out there. But the biggest scam in all of crypto during the Gary Gensler era was come in and register. He was the biggest scammer out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
and
so let's just think about that for a second, right? Like, how it is hard to imagine the sensation of trying to move forward a powerful, open, access expanding, sort of democratically imbued in some ways, libertarian imbued also technology in the face of such violent headwinds. Right? You don't normally think of tiny startup industries like fighting against the full force of the U.S. government, but that was kind of what it was like during that era.
And it's interesting, it was my job to gather information, right? And so what would happen is people would leave the SEC and they would join law firms, and then they would pitch me to hire them. They left the SEC, and all of them would talk about how much they hated Gary Gensler and how this was politically motivated, and so I'd gather information. Actually, met with him very early on, before his speech about how he hated crypto, and he had a speechwriter on a call with us all, and he said, "Oh, I invited my speechwriter just in case I have some zingers. She can write them down, and we can include them in my speech next week." So having the full force of the government at the beginning of this administration, a guy who was known for being a very effective regulator at the CFTC, we were told he was unbeatable, right? And he essentially eliminated the SPAC industry with like one accounting rule change. I remember we also had not been super heavily financed, right? We did an airdrop. We had a Series A. We didn't raise that much money.
Relatively small.
We had the full force of the U.S. government at our back. And I do remember a few of our investors saying, we're not going to let you die, and investing a bunch. And then I could afford lawyers and we could fight them. It's great.
But yeah, it was tough. I mean, I'm kind of curious. I'm sort of curious about the counterfactual. Like, if it hadn't taken so much resources to survive during that period, where all this technology would we be that much further along, right? And all this technology. If you think about it, Uniswap was really fortunate in that. So Hayden had started it in about 2018 informally, and then it had just taken off, and he had launched a token that gave the company some resources right before Gary Gensler kind of revealed his antagonism. And so then we could survive that whole time. And we had adoption that we could then like raise money on. And we had a killer team already and then had some resources. So that allowed us to survive. But like otherwise any other team who wanted to build something quite creative that was going to challenge a norm and how financial services operated was scared. And people went offshore. Yeah. So a lot of great teams actually of Americans like just moved offshore because they didn't want to deal with this.
I think a lot of American entrepreneurs just decided to say fuck it and not start companies in this space.
Totally. And still kind of now maybe, and it's sort of striking to me, sometimes people still have that attitude even though the environment has changed. But I think maybe we'll just start to see more adoption of blockchains and crypto, just like not described as such.
I think there's probably two things that are likely to happen. One is crypto, quote unquote crypto, gets a little less scary and a little more accepted. And then also it just shows up under the hood and you don't even know it's there. And so everything on the stablecoin side, it's like you're going to start to see stablecoins in Robinhood and in every other fintech and, in your Stripe account and whatnot. And it's just going to be there and you'll use it just the way you don't think about you using, TCP/IP when you watch a YouTube video. And at the same time, I think we're seeing more and more things turn into tokens and be traded and, exist all the way from, media, to, things that look more like financial instruments, collectibles. It will continue to seep in and become more and more commonplace and more, less weird, basically, over time.
Yeah. And I mean, generally, good ideas went out over time. And during those 4 years, while we were talking to lots of folks who worked at the SEC, they would be like, oh, wow. So this Uniswap thing provides like 24/7 long tail liquidity, better than anything that the SEC's ever thought of. Let me send you some documents from the roundtable we did 3 years ago, where we didn't come up with any good ideas on how to increase liquidity for long tail assets that have these these high spreads and there's no, but your solution works. And our solution tends to be a lot of trading between 4 and 5 p.m. Monday through Friday, at the very end of the day, to get all liquidity providers together, right? And it solves other problems like transparency versus dark pools and brokers not being able to front run. It solves wow, this is great. This solves so many problems and it's all transparent in code. Like, why doesn't the SEC this? Like, we had so many roundtables trying to find answers to these questions, and here they are. But no one at the SEC then was willing to hear it. And I think over time, enough people will just adopt these solutions.
There was a time where folks in Washington were kind of curious about these properties of crypto systems, and then very much not curious during the Gensler era, and the stigma developed, and it was like a really dark stigma, basically. And I think soon it feels like now we are back in the realm of let's actually forget the word crypto and let's just sort of examine some of the properties of this fabric as like a financial fabric and a computing fabric, and talk about things like 24/7 global liquidity, transparency, programmability, auditability. If you just describe the feature set of this financial fabric to somebody who is interested in financial systems, they'd be interested.
Yeah.
You call it crypto, they're not interested.
Yeah. Well, I would say to my lefty friends out there, like the prodigal son, you're welcome back. Like I was introduced to crypto through these lefty groups, right? We work with groups on the right and the left for net neutrality and open internet, but they're the ones who introduced me to crypto. And a lot of folks owned crypto in that community and were interested in it generally. And then Gary Gensler came along and imposed his like politically motivated discipline on them all. And then all of them came to hate it. And I gave a talk to this like group of kind of this lefty group. And I said, how many of you don't like crypto? And a lot of them raised their hands. And I said, how many of you didn't like crypto in 2020? And they're like, oh, I don't know. I was like, I know, because I was there. You didn't hate crypto then. You can come back. You had that 4-year, off in the wilderness. Just come back. It's okay. We'll forgive you.
And so, Marvin, you've been largely focused with your efforts on the policy and regulatory side. And of course, that's been your focus too, MC, but also I feel like you've spent more time talking to Wall Street institutions about this. And do you have a sense of, how their view of this is evolving?
It's funny because, I think summer 2021, I spent my first month at Uniswap, like getting very deep in the Ethereum world and community, but also checking in with people across different parts of fintech and finance to see who'd want to use Uniswap. And at the time, people were very interested in using Uniswap.
They were.
I'm sorry, I'm thinking of right now. Anyway, they were very interested in using Uniswap at that time, and we accidentally, one of our employees accidentally shared how interested they were in public without them all knowing, and that was an example of like, oh, this world of ultimate transparency in crypto here, not quite the same as what all those publicly regulated companies were expecting when they talked to us. But then honestly, not for the last 3 years. Like from 2021 to 2024, I didn't spend hardly any time trying to convince anyone to use crypto who wasn't already bought into it. It was just like clear that that wasn't going to be an opportunity. And instead, we spent most of our time trying to build products to improve the user experience and grow what users could do with Uniswap, right?
And maybe that's a blessing in hindsight.
I think so, right? The interest from Wall Street at the time was like, oh my gosh, look at all those tokens, look at all those prices, look at these numbers, all this volume, whatever, all the billions of dollars that moved onto blockchains, what should we do? But the reality was blockchains were still too slow and too expensive to be even close to competitive.
Yep.
And so in the past 4 or 5 years, that's changed a lot. So I think maybe
Unichain.
Unichain, exactly. So Unichain.
And all the altcoins out there.
And all the other altcoins out there. So maybe that was a blessing that we had all that time in the bear market to just kind of focus on what would make the technology more useful. So we also launched this version 4 of the protocol, which allowed you to set all kinds of different parameters. If you really want to only trade certain hours a day, you can do that in version 4 of the Uniswap protocol. You can also like choose to only trade with certain people, or you can also set different kinds of market structure and ways. So basically, instead of having something that looks like a certain kind of financial market, you have this open developer platform where you can construct any kind of financial market. So those things happened. And then in the last 12 months, I've now started talking a lot more again to financial institutions, fintech players, and also now post, especially the stablecoin legislation that's just been signed this summer, now to a lot of like consumer brands who want to integrate stablecoins.
What do you think is likely to happen next? And what opportunities do you think are, in front of us right now?
There's so many opportunities in front of us right now. I mean, I think that I'm really excited about stablecoins as a starting point to store your money without needing a bank and a bank account, right? So I think it's the sort of most useful part of composable money, that then for people all over the world to have access to dollars and to be able to transact instantly. I think that this will be a part of how machines transact, right? Like we're using more and more machines under the hood of ChatGPT and all the LLMs. And so I think that stablecoins are going to be very effective for that, for like agentic commerce. I also am really hopeful that we'll start to see more and more kinds of markets like come on chain, right? So whether it's right now, there's a lot of attention on tokenizing stocks, but there's so much more, right, that you can bring all this liquidity to. So I think all those things I think are kind of obviously going to happen now. Like they're sort of all happening, and I think we'll see new companies, hopefully including mine, emerge to kind of like to scale those opportunities. I think they'll be much more competitive than the last several years of crypto were, and people try to figure out what the business models are they going to be different than traditional finance business models or crypto business models from mostly trading fees. The other thing though that I hope will happen, and I think will happen, is worthy to pursue, is that I hope stablecoins will become a path to adopt different forms of identity. And I do think that we see that like identity and verification is like it's really breaking faster and faster all the time, right?
Yep.
And you should be able to choose a kind of level of verification. And part of why that hasn't happened, I want to either scan my eyeball or I want to give you a bunch of documents, but I want to retain them myself, and you just verify as zero knowledge proof that they are what that you need them to be, or I don't give you anything at all, and then you choose what risk level you're willing to have with what you let me do. And I think that I hope that in 5 years we're like close to something like that. And part of why that hasn't happened is just like collective action. It's a hard coordination problem. But you see like little examples that are happening now. So in Australia, where they've now have kids under 16 aren't supposed to use social media. Now they're using ZK proofs to verify people's ages.
And for those who might not know, like what's the relationship between ZK proofs and sort of crypto and
basically you do a
stablecoins?
bunch of math to make sure that like something is what it says it is without holding the information yourself.
Right.
That's my layman's definition.
You can prove you're 16 without showing your license.
Right. And this is like, I think of this as cutting edge cryptographic technology that all stems from the same place that sort of crypto stems from.
One of the interesting things about crypto was that it would be this permissionless protocol where, like, unlike an API, you couldn't turn off. So Twitter had an API, and all these people built on top of the Twitter API, and they turned it off. Facebook, right? You can't turn off the API. I think that's really important. This open, permissionless layer. And the other piece was that there wasn't really a business model for open source. A lot of the open source protocols out there and software is like one person who's doing it in their spare time, right? And now you could have a business model around open source. And USV had done a lot of like thinking and blog posts about that, as did Chris Dixon. And during the Gary Gensler era, if you were building something kind of serious and there was a team that was trying to build something and solve a computer science problem or solve a financial problem, he would say, oh, it's centralized, I'm going to sue you. And so everyone made meme coins, and they would they passed the Bermuda test where they created some coin and they're like, it's a dog, right? And that was the most legal thing you could do under Gary Gensler, was create something worthless and fun, having no intrinsic value. Now I'm hoping we get back to people trying to create and solve really hard computer science problems, like Filecoin trying to do decentralized storage, which has been really interesting for like as AI evolves. Obviously the decentralized trading protocol that Uniswap builds and invests in, and so where I'm hoping that we're going to be using AI, decentralization, decentralized compute, and blockchains to solve some computer science problems, including like identity and how do you solve some of the problems inherent, to make the internet better, to make communication better, and that's what's exciting to me.
A little more regulatory certainty around what you're allowed to build and how you can build it, and really like a path to bring these types of systems to market should invite people in to solve hard problems. We just backed a team that's working on solar subsidies, and there's others that are working on access to wireless telecom networks. And I just think there's a whole universe of real world coordination and infrastructure and kind of higher level financial issues that can be approached using this technology, but everybody's been too afraid to do it for the last little while. So you said something earlier about, the open internet. We thought it was going to be, free information for everybody. And then it turns out we're all just like doom scrolling TikTok and getting, our minds adjusted by, foreign powers or whatever. So you don't always get what you think you're going to get. And so we've been focusing a lot on the struggle to get crypto and DeFi kind of into the mainstream, which is kind of starting to happen. But I also don't want to ignore the potential things that, potential bad things. So like, if we could just put on our pessimistic hats for a minute and, think about things where we should be careful about or concerned about, like what kinds of things come to mind?
So I like to think about what are the like bad outcomes that you want to build a product to protect against, right? Because it's really important to me to work on what you hope is the right side of history. And I think that in crypto and in DeFi, I still think it's still so open-ended that the impact it has in the world is still path dependent on the people and the teams who build it and what they choose to use it for, because it's very powerful. So when I think about like the risks that can happen in DeFi, it's basically, can people, you can lose money in any system, but could people be convinced, it could like be defrauded in some way, right? So you want to protect consumers from being able, that's a very loaded phrase, but you basically want to help people make sure they understand the risk that they're taking themselves. You don't want, you probably don't want to help evil around the world aggregate funds and transact. Governments care about you, help make sure that people pay their taxes. And then think about the systemic risk that could be created or increased. And I think there are actually concrete ways to address all of those in DeFi systems that have been developed the past several years. Like you can have even better disclosure. Think about how to protect, how to help people understand that you know what you're doing. You can have even better disclosure about all kinds of stuff, right? In real time, in DeFi. In like paying taxes, you can do even more detailed, integrated, sort of like aggregation of information about your taxes across all of your accounts, as opposed to having to have like different forms for every single different account. You can catch bad guys more easily, faster, in real time and block them if you want to, as opposed to, using filing tons of reports after the fact. That one to me is kind of baffling that the government hasn't figured out that actually they could have even more effective anti-money laundering.
Yep.
It's just that what money laundering is so broadly defined. There's no checklist for what exactly constitutes it and what information you exactly need. It's kind of a subjective assessment. So to me, those three things are like very solved. The thing that I think about the most now is like, what kind are we making big global financial systems more robust or not? And I think that there are a lot of really compelling arguments that DeFi and crypto can make, like global markets and the way that money moves around the world, much, much more robust. But right now it's still kind of an open question, right? You have to have like overall computing networks that are safe, code that doesn't get hacked, and then think about like what creates, different kinds of like insolvency risk and runs on markets. But I think even if you think about going back to a stablecoin, the idea that you can save $1 and not have to you can store money and not have an unsecured loan,
Yep.
That's very helpful. And one thing that's been kind of strange to me as this legislation passed like a month or so ago or 3 weeks ago is all these critiques about the bad things that could happen if we decentralize money storage. And many of them didn't really make a lot of sense, actually. It was just this argument of like, well, if you have more places store money, then more organizations and teams could do bad things. Well, but they all have the same set of rules if they're in America. So I think sometimes like just this, like the decentralization that we were talking about earlier can be misunderstood broadly as like expanding and spreading risk.
Right.
Which isn't necessarily true.
Ironically, the risk in the system is
the
banks.
It's the banks,
right? Because the banks have very little capital compared to how much they lend out.
For sure.
Right. And so they're very, what they call fragile, right? And they have to be bailed out all the time. Their bank runs all the time.
Yep.
Right. And we just a few years ago, it happens all the time. They are the risk in the system. The risk in the system is not, putting $1 in a stablecoin and that being held in treasuries. That's much less risky.
Yep.
Right. And there's sort of like stablecoins are kind of similar to the idea of like a narrow bank, which is the narrow bank is this idea where like you essentially pay someone to custody your money, right? And then you can also use it for electronic payments. This is how banks make money. They take custody and they lend, and they make money on like credit card and fees, And so crypto makes both of those a lot cheaper, so it's competitive to the banks, right? But narrow banks were usually denied because they were going to be so safe that people would put all their money in it, pull their money out of the normal banks. And we rely on banks to make loans. You could actually have a financial system where you disentangle custody, electronic payments from the loan-making apparatus, because those loans are backed by so little capital as it is.
Yep.
But I agree with everything MC said about potential risks. One of the big risks is kind of like the surveillance and kind of the government using this powerful technology to spy on people a bit more, to do credit scoring, to kind of determine when you can spend your money or not in some ways, or at least monitor everything you do.
I think the end of fractionalized banking is like one category of, if this really goes big, what does it mean there? And then privacy is like a really other big one. And today, as I think most people know, most of what happens in crypto is on-chain, public on-chain, and maybe obscured or abstracted between your identity and your wallet. But you can see it's on-chain. There is a lot of work going on to introduce privacy in certain ways, zero-knowledge proofs and other sort of zero-knowledge systems. Tornado Cash verdict did it already happen? Or it's like any minute now.
Yeah.
So I do think privacy is a big one. Is it your view that we just get used to having less financial privacy, or that we figure out a way to add the right level of financial privacy on top of crypto?
I hope it's the latter.
Yeah.
Right? I hope it's the latter. And maybe it's a little bit of both. Like maybe we kind of adjust the things, you know what I mean? We have some adjustment of the things that we think of as like embarrassing to have the world know. It's more, but you do want privacy in the things that can ultimately be like used against you unjustly, right?
Right.
I don't know. I think you and I, when we were hanging out before the show, watched this short AI-generated video about two people debating each other whether or not people actually care about privacy and how much they care about privacy. And I remember the first time someone tried to argue with me that people don't care that much about privacy was I was still in college, And there's people signing up for credit cards. They'd give you a free t-shirt if you sign up for a credit card. And you'd walk up and you'd fill out all of your life's information,
Right.
your
For a free
address,
t-shirt. Yeah.
for a free credit, for a free t-shirt. And I think a lot of people still don't understand like why privacy is beneficial. And it is sort of a societal level thing, right? No one really feels like, well, I don't have, there's no reason to blackmail me, or there's no reason for the government to care what I'm doing. I'm not doing anything wrong. But if you don't have kind of society-wide privacy, then like no one can rise up and be a leader to challenge without their dirty laundry being used against them or being twisted a certain way. So it's a hard concept to wrap your head around. And when you read about the history of privacy violations and why some of these laws were passed, the things that the government was doing, often to like other political parties, like the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, are pretty astonishing, but they're not like taught in schools. Like you kind of learn about them in these like obscure privacy journals, and you're like, wow, that happened. So I think it's hard to convince people.
Here at USV, we've been, we talk about what are our current investment theses at any point in time. And one of the ones that has been rolling around recently is this idea of moving from DeFi to AllFi. So the idea that it's more or less inevitable that the economy will move on chain. Do you think that's what's happening?
That is the vision and the thesis of Uniswap, right? That DeFi will be the rails for AllFi. So I'd say, at least for me, I had to believe that vision to be at Uniswap. And I think that's right. How long would it take? I feel like MC might have a better answer on that one.
I do think that we have a shot at having many big pillars of finance ultimately be on-chain in some way. And I think that will happen. I think within the next 5 years, there'll be a couple big pillars of finance and big pillars of markets that will happen. AllFi, all markets, I don't know, a couple decades.
Do you have any take on which ones will go first, second, and third?
I think part of what's hard to answer this question is like the biggest markets are not retail markets in global finance and global markets, right? They're institutions. And crypto has been so retail and consumer led. And so part of the question is like, is that going to start to change? And if that starts to change, then what, like either financial products or other benefits, probably revenue and profit opportunities will bring bigger pools of capital on chain. And I think for that to happen, you need to have market structures that are like competitive on cost and speed. And they're starting to see some of those. You have to have some really boring stuff change. Like it has to be easier for regulated institutions to like hold crypto on their balance sheet, for example, right? So a couple, and maybe you need to have a couple of things in the tax policy change too. So some of those very boring things do need to start to change, and they can be led by, I think even now you see this now, more high frequency trading, prop trading firms and hedge funds that have fewer restrictions are starting to trade on chain on places like Hyperliquid. So I think that will start to evolve. So that's a way of saying like, I could see it being derivatives. I could see it being something really boring, like repo where you need global money movement. But I think it kind of depends on which of the like little things standing in the way start to fall over.
Right. And maybe also what are the features of doing it on chain that prove to be so much more beneficial.
Yeah.
In addition to the blocking and tackling of, the tax and custody and other kind of like blockers. But I think the question is like, you can program new things on these rails to solve problems in new ways. And, probably like perps have been the best example of like a new financial primitive that didn't really exist before crypto that now exists and has, is one of the breakout, primitives. And so I imagine there are versions of that are, going to unlock this sort of institutional wave that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm curious, I'm not sure how it's going to happen. I'm curious what you guys think too. Like, I've talked to a few like the world's biggest financial firms in the past couple of months where they want to reach out and they're like, how can we use Uniswap and how can we use DeFi? And they want you to, sometimes they kind of want you to come sit next to them and see exactly how they do everything today.
Right.
And then put it in a smart contract and then put it in a protocol and put it in a blockchain. And like, it's not really how this stuff has gotten adopted. Like perfectly a great example. It's not like someone who's trading futures, like, it's kind of annoying that there's an end date. It's kind of annoying I have to hold the underlying really. And I have this like directional view. Like someone else just kind of invented.
And then the capital kind of came to it
Exactly.
on someone else's invention.
Now, people
Right.
who had been trading, who
Sure.
understood trading markets. So I'm I don't know if it's going to be this I don't know if it's going to look like enterprise software,
I think that the example we always use from the early internet is the first ideas for how to bring media on chain were to make the New York Times as a PDF, right? And put that on a website. And I think that's sounds like this subversion of just copy pasting the institutional process on chain. There's probably going to be some shape shifting, in that process and an invention mode that we haven't seen yet.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, people want to hold money. You want more freedom, right? You want it to be able to hold money. You want to be able to send it around. You want to be able to make more. And so there's only so many different ways you do that. And a lot of the ways that you do that today are a function of the tech stack and the operations and the different rules. So that's part of why I'm not sure. I think that we'll see people come up with all kinds of different creative applications.
If you were building a company today with this idea of moving from DeFi to AllFi in mind, would you focus on consumer or would you focus on institutional?
Part of what I love about crypto is that you don't really have to choose, actually. So you have to choose in who your initial customers you're focusing on are, but the product often is usable for both. So I think that's a thing that I think having a consumer mindset, I mean, I'm not really answering your question, but I think having a consumer mindset whenever you build is imperative. And that's it's like going backwards to not have that, even if you're building for institutions.
Working in a consumer application and protocol, we've got to think through, how do you make this simple for the average person? How do you meet their needs? How do you do user testing? It's, your question is sort of what market would you go after? But part of it is what's more fun and interesting to build in addition that and neither of them could work. And I've enjoyed the consumer. I've enjoyed both, but I've enjoyed the consumer for the last 4 years.
One thing that's so interesting to me about crypto is that I think you mentioned before that crypto protocols are sort of always on APIs. Mm-hmm. And if you're building at the protocol layer and you're also building at the interface layer, you kind of get this 2-for-1 of consumer and developers, mm-hmm. which is just very cool. Mm-hmm. And because they're both user groups that can take a product in different directions and have unpredictable and organic growth.
And that's one thing I also experienced in robo advice. And then again, when I was building a sustainable investing business, is that those were ultimately about the hardest part about growing those businesses was helping consumers figure out their preferences in money. And so if now we have these magical thinking machines that can help us figure out kind of our preferences and structure our thinking, but they don't quite connect to money yet, in part because money actually isn't as machine ingestible as you would think it is.
Right.
So I hope that crypto starts to change some of that. And then ultimately this all becomes a much more accessible.
It's actually interesting. I met with a congresswoman yesterday. I sometimes have to do that. And she had been a banker, and she was actually a congresswoman from Michigan, where I'm from. And she saw my last name. She said, "Oh, when I was a banker, I gave your second cousin a loan for his business." And it reminded me, my dad had a store when I was a kid, and the banker who lent us money to buy inventory and stuff was extended family. We knew that was a really important thing.
Sure.
These kind of one of the functions of money is sort of getting money from savers and kind of the old and the people who have succeeded already to folks who have a great idea, who want to build something, right? What venture capital does and what banking does. And the amount of opportunity that gets unlocked by being able to borrow money or access these markets that kind of only have in the US and a few other countries. It's that was the American dream. That was the greatest gift my parents could give us was democracy and access to markets to be able to pursue your dreams. And the things that the way that stablecoins can unlock that globally, the way that DeFi can unlock that, it's kind of like the slow hunch mm-hmm. we've been working on. And it just kind of reminded me of the people who would lend my dad money when we needed it.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful. I think that is a perfect idea to end on, this idea that you can access capital, you can use it to build new things, and that opportunity can be, more broadly distributed, more broadly accessible, more, just that those possibilities can be put in more people's hands directly, I think is an incredibly empowering idea.
Should
we
awesome.
do it? All right. Thank you guys. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick.